tuning in. This is George here from Lucia. I'm here with Avi Wiesenberg. He's a strategic advisor and CRO for early stage startups and scaling companies. And we want to take a chance here to kick off our first podcast. So Avi, thank you for joining us. How's it going today?
A pleasure, George. Great to be here.
Excellent. We'd love to have you. So why don't we start by this? I'd love for you to tell our listeners about yourself and your journey, how we got here today.
So my name's Avi Wiesenberg. I have been in sales for probably over 15 years now. But I would say I was born into sales. You know, I grew up in a household where my father sold textiles in the East End of London. I was one of those kids selling lemonade outside the house, selling bubble gum at school, etc. So, you know, my history has always been, I would say, sales/entrepreneurial. But I really got into tech sales at an early stage. Right after university, I joined Oracle, actually moved out to Oracle, moved to Dublin in Ireland, probably the best people in the world to learn interpersonal and sales skills from, and also the ability to both be coherent while drinking as well. So that was a great introduction into the world of sales. I was at Oracle and then progressed with Oracle, worked in the City of London for a while, working on big database deals with some of the biggest banks in the world. And around 12 years ago, moved out to Israel and really entered into the startup world. So, you know, I got involved very early in the Israeli tech scene. And that was really my first foray into SaaS, or software as a service, which is pretty much the de facto of what everyone is selling today. But it was a big jump in those days from old school license sales to SaaS sales. And I haven't really looked back from there. Joined a company called ClickTel, which now became Content Square and recently became a unicorn. Went from them to a company called Apsi, which sold out recently to ServiceNow. And then from there to SimilarWeb, where I helped grow the business from the 20 to 60 million stage in ARR. And actually, as you know, was CRO of Lucia for a year or so in the great scaling stage of about 700K MRR to 1.3. I know the revenues have continued to shoot up from there and are growing and continuing to scale. And now I work and advise a range of different companies, both scaling in the scale up stage as well as the startup stage across the ecosystem. So enjoying meeting loads of new technologies, really interesting founders and startups in the market.
Wow, I'd love to hear that. And I can definitely relate a little bit to it. I started out as Oracle as well, my first sales career in SaaS, and kind of grew into that, started going to smaller companies as well. And there's definitely a huge difference there, but everything you learn can carry you over pretty much.
It's a great school to learn the art of sales in Oracle. It was a very sales-driven culture, and it was incredible experience.
Definitely, I agree with it too. So you've been doing this for a long time, over 15 years now. How do you see sales different now compared to when you first started in London?
So I think it's definitely evolved, but I think it was already starting to change even when I was at Oracle. You know, I went into Oracle worried that I wasn't going to be able to cut it in the world of sales that was still kind of predicated on whining and dining. You know, I'm a religious Jew. I kept kosher. You know, the ability to wine and dine was limited. My golf game was non-existent. It's improved a bit since, but it was non-existent. You know, and I was super concerned about how I would be able, especially when I made the transition from Dublin to the City of London, how I would be able to kind of integrate into that sales culture and that sales environment. And actually, even back in those days, it had already started to change. This was post Sarbanes-Oxley. There were already a lot of requirements about what gifts people could receive. And the business case had to be legit. People wanted to understand that there was a real business case for what they were buying, that you had to do proof of concepts. And don't get me wrong, there were still deals where people were buying Oracle because they were buying Oracle. And I still believe that the relationship, people still buy from people. But I think that was already there, that business case. Now, I think SaaS changed the game even more and took it even further, that there was less risk involved on the client side, but it became more transactional. So I think the internet changed it as well. With Oracle, there was a limited amount people could understand on the pricing and the discounts, and a lot of untransparent practice, let's call it. today's sales environment is incredibly transparent, very much predicated on customer success and customer centricity. Now, I believe even back in those Oracle days, it was still a customer-centric sale. We still had to make sure the technology worked. We still wanted to make sure the customer got what they needed. But I would say less of the research had been done beforehand. Today, people are walking into a sale where they've done a huge amount of research, and the role of the salesperson has transitioned a little bit to be more of a curator of information, where they're presenting information and they're being the middleman. So they're helping the person buy, that still exists, and they're helping be the middleman between the two companies. But a lot of that information is already out there, a lot more on things like G2 Crowd, and those types of things, whereby we now have to make sure that we don't screw up the sale, but some of the sale, at least some elements of it, should be done beforehand. Ultimately, even if you're buying a car, you're going to do a ton of research beforehand, but you're still going to walk into the showroom, you're still going to want the test drive, and if the sales guy is unlikable and screws it up, you're still going to have a problem. So those are all important aspects.
Definitely, and I think we're all seeing it too, not only in business to business sales, but business to consumer sales, right? Like you mentioned the car earlier. Most of the buying journey's done. 70% of it's done before you talk to your first seller, right? Or first person that you're supposed to buy off. But speaking of that, do you think that I honestly think we have, but do you think we've gone further in terms of coming out with sales tools that actually help salespeople sell more in today's world? And what are some of your go-to tools that you sorry to cut you off, that you'd want to build off of to go off that question?
Yeah, sales tools is a fascinating question. And going back, we'll go back again to my Oracle days, right? So we've got this challenge whereby I was at Oracle, and now I'm aging myself, but just after the PeopleSoft acquisition, right? So right after that, the Siebel acquisition took place. And I was there from the transition from Oracle CRM to a single instance of Siebel that we all had to use as CRM. And, the irony was Oracle was very good at eating its own dog food, right? We had to use our own systems. But as sales guys, even back in those days, it was a case of jumping into the forecast just before your sales meeting or at the end of each month to make sure your forecast was cleaned up. And that was it. We didn't live in the CRM the way that people do today. We didn't tag every single interaction, especially when you're looking at field sales. Right? It was like the busier you were, the more meetings you were at, the less time you were in the office, and especially the less time you had to fill in every goddamn field in the CRM, right? And that, by the way, just to be clear, one of my favorite characters in the sales world is Corporate Bro, if you don't follow him on Instagram, right? And he just says it as it is, because sales guys are that nature. We don't want to fill in countless fields for sales ops. And sales ops wasn't even such a big industry back in those days, but Salesforce is a much easier to use system. And I think salespeople have got better at understanding how to use the CRM for themselves rather than for management. And I think that's one of the biggest changes that's happened, that people can understand, rather than working off their own spreadsheets or off their own email or off their own kind of balagan or mess, right? That we're now at the point where the salesperson understands that if they get their own reports and their own dashboards, and the CRMs themselves are better at enabling the salesperson to use them, that they can get value from them. I think that's a huge change in terms of sales tools. So if I look at sales tools, I'm gonna speak from a potential point of nepotism. My wife actually works at Gong, but Gong is my favorite new sales tool that's out there at the moment. They're getting a huge amount of buzz, and let's be really clear, at its absolute core, it's the ability to record a sales call, right? And people have kind of been doing that for a very long time. Now, with the fact that everyone's gone online and the fact that a lot more of these sales calls are happening in what I would call a hybrid sales approach, where you'll maybe have a Zoom and then a face-to-face or whatever it is, Gong has taken that ability to read those calls, to understand them, and to use them, I would say, in a dual aspect. One is for management in terms of coaching, revenue intelligence, understanding if the deal is going to close, understanding the playbook, analyzing the playbook. And the other is for the salesperson to use them in what I would call an augmentation. Actually, it's really interesting. The book's right in front of me, so I'll show it. One of the favorite books I've read recently in the last year or so is this one, which is called The Adaptation Advantage by Heather McGowan. Fascinating book about the future of work and the idea that in essence we've moved from the information age where we had to learn things, we had to go to university, we have all this information on the internet, we can watch as many videos as we want, to what she calls the augmentation age. And if you think about it, for example, from a surgeon, we're not replacing the skills that a surgeon needs, but we're augmenting them with technology. He's now going to have better MRIs, better X-rays, better computers, better AI to tell him what to do. The same if you think about fighter pilots and everything going on in the cockpit now, you've got an absolute ability here to understand everything in front of you in terms of the data and what's happening and give you recommendations, but ultimately you need to be the person that executes on it. And I think that's a fascinating piece. And I think one of the ways that salespeople themselves can use Gong, whether it's recommending next steps, whether it's listening back to your calls, whether it's looking for those cues, whether it's automatically adding in the next steps into the calendarizations. You know, if you think about everything that Superhuman from an email standpoint, or even Google Calendar, where it's automatically picking up your next step and your next action, that's augmentation. That's going to make us more efficient. It's going to make us better. It's going to make us help make better decisions and ultimately close more. And that's what we want as salespeople. So that's probably my biggest, plus point in terms of tools, is that aspect of augmentation, finding things that you can work with easily, quickly, that will add efficiencies and augmentation. The second big thing for me, and maybe in the same tune, is what I would call this whole layer now. And I'm working with 2 or 3 companies I've seen in this space now that are collating all of the publicly available data that's out there about people. So there used to be an app years ago called Charlie app that would look at your calendar before you started the day and give you a breakdown of the people that you're going to meet that day. Now, good salespeople know they have to do their homework and they have to do their research, and they're going to go, hey, George, we both worked at Oracle, we both did this, icebreakers, etc. That information, a lot of that's now online. I can look up what articles you've written, what comments you've made on Twitter, who you follow, who your influencers are, what you're interested in, what football team you support. All of that information is relatively publicly available information. And without crossing the creepy line, and it's a whole nother debate over what crosses that creepy line in terms of pre-knowledge, you can prep much better for meetings. There are companies out there, one of them called Amy, one of them called a Magnify, that are looking at those public data sources, and I think they're really interesting as well. So I think that's what I would say. Look for tools that can augment you and help you, that can be used both from a management standpoint in terms of coaching and the science element, but also still allow you to adapt and use your art and the CRM. If you learn how to use it properly and use it well, it's going to be your greatest asset and greatest tool.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And I think, in terms of the sales role, I don't think it's fundamentally changed. I think we've just been offered, different sets of tools to help us be more efficient and effective during our day-to-day. Because at the end of the day, you still have to show the value to customers. You still have to make sure there's a need for your solution that you're selling. But from your perspective, and I think based on what you just told me about the sales tools, do you think the role of a salesperson has fundamentally changed with the introduction of all these different new technologies that we have? You mentioned Gong, Alice, and a few other tools. Even, CRM systems.
Yeah, I think what we're looking at here is this amalgamation of kind of art versus science. It used to be one of my favorite theoretical debates about sales. Is sales an art or a science? And I think at its core, people buy from people, right? You can look at Daniel Pink, To Sell Is Human. Ultimately, sales is very much a mixture of both. And I think where we're at in depends on the company, but a lot of technologies now are trying to become more and more and more transactional, right? They're trying to lead to, I know what Lucia terms product-led growth. Lucia's a big fan of talking about product-led growth, that it's relatively a relatively simplistic product with a clear value that should be able to be understood and then purchased and procured. I do think, though, people still buy from people at its core. I think we're humans, and I think that's part of it. And we need to build that trust, and we need to build that ability for human connection, which will ultimately lead to the trust in order to move from the status quo. My big belief in sales is you're always trying to get someone to move from the status quo to change the way they do something. So if today I use, and I'll go to your job, George, right? if today someone's using Zoom Info and they're happy with Zoom Info, what is it that's going to get them to change the status quo to move to using Lucia? Now, it may be you just have to get them to that pain point where there's one contact that they don't have the number for and they're willing to try another data source. And that's enough of a move from the status quo that allows you the foot in the door. But in order to help people understand that and move towards that, you need some level of ability to work them through that logic and that process. And I think that's the role of the salesperson. Now, more and more companies are defining that playbook. But let's be clear, the world is not static. The world is changing continuously and even more rapidly than it ever has done before. So the minute you've got your playbook sorted and you think, this is now a science, I know exactly how to run the playbook, I know the flow, I know how this should run through, it will change. And unless you have salespeople that understand a little bit of that art, a little bit of the agility, a little bit of the understanding in order to hack a little bit here and there, you're not going to be able to adapt and evolve that playbook as quickly as you should in order to move it forward and to keep perfecting it and to keep adding efficiencies. So I think that is still the role of the salesperson. Again, it depends if it's an early stage company. An early stage company, they don't have that defined playbook and potentially need more of what I would term a sales hacker than potentially at later stages where you want people that can follow the playbook and are very coachable and can potentially be plugged in to one of Mark Roberge's, sales accelerator formula models and can go and run from there. But I think that that's a key piece on it and being able to actually to combine those two elements.
Definitely. I think you brought up a good point too. You mentioned something about, salespeople being able to adapt to change. Do you think that's more on the actual individual contributor themselves or more so on leadership and management to influence, keeping up with industry changes and what's going on in the market outside of it? Because there's so much going on everywhere. Yeah. Where like whose responsibility is it and who should take ownership of kind of bringing on that education?
I think it's both, by the way. And I think, look, the number one thing that I usually look for in a sales hire is business acumen. I want to know that they really deeply are interested in business, are interested in the customers, can get in the customer's head, can think about business holistically. And if they can't, then that's a really big problem for me, both in terms of building credibility with the customer and in terms of what you're talking about, understanding the industry, understanding the trends, understanding the profession, understanding how things are moving and changing and the agility of how they're going to fit into that wider picture and model. I think it's on management to make sure that they are open and respecting people that are bringing those thoughts forward. Because if they don't, then the individual contributors won't bother spending any time on that. If I come to a Monday morning meeting going, oh, did you see this, and this? And I feel that my manager just couldn't give a damn about what's happening in the market. It's like, well, I'm not going to bring it up again, and I'm probably not going to be as interested as I was in it beforehand. Whereas if your management or your team lead or whoever it is can have a good educated conversation with you about this acquisition, you see these guys bought those guys, and you see, oh, in our industry, we're working financial services, this is happening, this regulation is coming, that's coming in, how does that affect us, how does that affect our positioning, etc., etc. That will encourage people to start focusing on those things and understanding that those are the conversations that you have to have as a salesperson in order to have credibility in the space, right? When you're speaking to market leaders, and by the way, this to a certain extent differentiates between dealing with enterprise deals and the higher up in the chain you go in terms of the people that you're speaking with, the more these bigger macro holistic issues in the industry are what they're thinking about and affecting them, that you want to show an educated, credible conversation around and show them that you're a credible partner and your company is working with them and thinking about these things the same way they are.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. And I think that's some good feedback for, me and my team as well. We'll take that and carry it on. So, I mean, it takes us to a next question, right? Like, how do you measure sales success? And what are some of the metrics that you look at to identify if the organization or team are moving in the right direction?
So I think we need to look at the metrics question in terms of either the team or the management and in terms of the individual, right? Like as an individual, how do you know if you're moving in the right direction? How do you know if your sales are going well, etc.? And I think, there's a range of different things. From a company standpoint, look, it will depend on the individual company. It will depend on how well your pipeline's built. It depends on all the metrics. There's all the standard ones you're going to look at. You're going to want to take Roberge's model in terms of number of calls and number of emails and number of touch points. You're going to want to understand what your funnel looks like and whether people are keeping up with the metrics that they're supposed to be doing and that you're running those in the right way. And you want to build efficiencies at every stage of that funnel as well. At the end of the day, one of my favorite Hebrew words is tachlis, right? Which means, let's get to the meat and potatoes. What's the real thing? Show me the money, right? Show me the money. Like, I've always said that, like, I'm not one of those, when I've managed my sales teams, I'm not one of those micromanagers that wants to look at every call metric. I will drill down on your metrics if you're not hitting your number. If you're hitting your number, happy days. Now, that's evolved a little bit in the market today because the more mature the company is getting, the more they understand the playbook, the more they want to understand whether people that are following the playbook are efficient or not efficient, and therefore they want to be more specific. And that's probably coming from my Oracle enterprise sales, pedigree days where it was like, no one asked you what you were doing. It just mattered whether you hit your number at the end of the quarter or not, right? And if you hit your number, you can go and sit on the beach. And at my core, I still want to manage like that. I think in today's world, it's much more difficult to manage like that. And I to a certain extent, feel sorry for people growing up as salespeople in SaaS metrics, that they don't always get that anymore. Because especially with more transactional deals and especially at the SaaS level, it's become a lot more based on, can you follow the playbook and get the efficiencies, and we can measure. Remember, today you can measure everything. Number of minutes on a call, the number of calls, like everything's measurable. And the more visibility you can get on those measures, the more data, the more you can understand it, the more you can better manage it. And I do understand that, and I think it's an important element of it. What I would go further, though, is the big metrics for me, if I were managing a team today, is especially in startups, and especially in scale-up companies, it's not always just about money, it's about the right money. And the right money to me means you've got good NPS scores, are your customers happy, right? Are you closing the deals that will grow? Are you closing the deals that will be good for the customer and good for the company? And getting those deals through. As the individual, I want to say that for the individual, there's a big element here for you to understand. If you want to understand it, number one, your forecast accuracy. Are you really in control of your deals? Do you really know which ones are going to close? And are you getting the next steps that you either promised or were promised to you? So that's a big metric that I would start measuring. Great activity to do, even just for yourself as a sales guy. Not just did you hit your number, but did you hit your number on the deals that you said were going to close? And that's showing me whether you've got real control, right? It's okay to go, yeah, I'm going to hit my number, because you've got enough coverage that you're going to hit your number, which is super important. Did you hit your number on the deals that you thought you were going to hit your number or not? And if not, why not? Right? So you've got to really understand, and a good pulse check on that is the people that said they were going to get back to you properly. Have you built that rapport and that relationship where those guys actually want to move forward with you and actually give you the next step that they promised you?
I like that a lot. And I think, it's all about accountability, right? At the end of the day, holding yourself accountable to it. So, because no one knows your book of business better than yourself. So if you are forecasting some things, you have your top 5 deals that don't think you're coming in, but you just have them down just because you feel good about them, you're doing yourself, a dishonest favor that right there. So I like those points a lot. Thank you for sharing them. Now let's move on to something I think a little bit different than these questions, right? And I think that these will probably be good based on your experience as a strategic advisor and a CRO for all different size companies. What are some, when do you know that you should be scaling a sales team? Like what is that sign that tells you, all right, now it's time to scale and grow this team out before you make those mistakes?
So it's a great question. It's going to be different in each company, but to a certain extent, there are a few indicators I would look for that tell you you're ready to start scaling. The biggest thing that people look at is, do I have product market fit? And I would say over and above product market fit, do you have go-to-market fit, right? Now, as a sales leader or a sales guy, if you're at the point where it's only been founder sales till now, firstly, I want to see someone other than the founder do the sales. So let's say we're at that point where you've got two sales guys, maybe an SDR, you're starting to sell, things are starting to go right. What then says, yeah, I'm ready to start scaling this? The biggest mistake I've seen with that is just adding salespeople without an understanding that the funnel can support it. The other mistake is, oh, I've got enough leads, I'm busy enough, I'm too busy, let me just add more salespeople. And I think you can start doing that, but you have to remember to look at it holistically. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the last 2 years or so, I've lost near on 30 kilo, and I got into running and doing sports. And what I found very often is I kept getting injured because I was pushing it too hard, too fast. And, you know, my hip flexor would go because maybe I was suffering an injury or a bruise on one side, and therefore your other ligaments are kind of trying to make up for it. And what will very often happen in an organization as you grow it is one department's going to end up pulling the slack for another that's weaker. So if you don't grow all of those muscle groups together, you can very often end up with an imbalance. What do I mean by that? If you start growing out sales without SDR, or you grow out SDR without sales, or you grow out marketing without SDR to follow up and do the qualification, or you grow out SDR without marketing to get the leads to come in. You know, I've been in organizations where, and I've worked with organizations where they were like, yeah, we're ready. We've got 3-4 customers. Everyone we speak to wants it. We just need to speak to more clients. Let's go. And they hadn't actually updated their website. Their website was utter crap, right? And you end up at the point where even though you're making cold calls and people are like, yeah, I'm interested, or you're sending out the emails, the first place they're going to go, let's remember, 60% of the sale happens, 70% of the sale happens before they're even on the phone with you. So even if you're pushing those cold leads, and where they're going to go? Your website or your blog, and there's nothing out there online. There's no G2 reviews. There's nothing that's been done holistically. Or you start pushing the sales, but then the product's not good enough. So when we work in the SaaS world, where we have to work on that circle where we've got POCs and customers bring more customers, and you start screwing up those first few customers, you're not ready. So there's an element of you can't wait forever, and I appreciate that you can't wait forever, and you have to sometimes bring the cart before the horse, etc. But you have to try and make sure that you're growing everything to as much as possible in tandem, and make sure that you're running before you're sprinting.
Definitely. It's like a bodybuilder that works out their upper body and doesn't exercise their legs.
Tell me about it. I've done everything except upper body work.
Yeah. But that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have to stretch, you have to warm up, make sure everything's kind of ready to go before you go compete or go, go play basketball.
And by the way, I would go even further, George, right? I've been in companies where they're scaling up very fast. And one of the biggest challenges with it is a great analogy told to me by someone who said it's a bit like a teenage kid who goes through a growth spurt and just has lost all control over his limbs and keeps knocking stuff over because the arms have just grown and the body hasn't quite figured out. You know, your marketing department grew faster than your finance department, which grew faster than this, and everything becomes a mess. And there's real friction involved with that when that happens, and it's genuinely quite painful for an organization as it scales up and has got to try and learn to rebalance and then control all of those departments, those limbs together to make sure that the customer doesn't see that kind of dyspraxic type of view of the world.
Yeah, I think that can definitely backfire. You know, for example, if someone goes on your website and it's taken a while to get some support, it might give the wrong impression to, show that, hey, this company might not be able to support me if I actually needed something help, right? And not only just to talk to an account executive or have a demo. Cool. Well, we're coming close to an end here, and I think we've had an awesome conversation. Avi, you've shared some very helpful tips and really good information here. We want to sign it off with a question for all the newbies getting into sales. Can you share a tip for people just getting into sales, junior salespeople, SDRs, BDRs?
So one of the favorite pieces of advice I was ever given. I was a young, leery, arrogant sales rep at Oracle back in the day. I think most Oracle sales reps are. At least back then they were. I think I just made the transition from Dublin to London, something like that. And I sat with one of the sales managers, one of the sales leaders, a guy called David Twiddle, actually, I think it was. And he said to me, he said, this is exactly the same as your father's textile business, the same as your schmutter business, right? He said, the only difference is we're giving you a base salary, we're giving you a computer, and we're giving you some leads. That this is your business. It's your franchise. You're a franchisee. Now, I know sales is evolved and sales has changed. And in the startup world, you feel a part of the business, you're growing. And there are some companies now that are looking to do no commission, etc. Even if you're in one of these companies, as a salesperson, you are the quarterback. You're the quarterback. It's your book of business. It is your job to be the middleman and get these deals closed. And the best way to view that is, this is my business. This is my franchise. This is my responsibility. And it's great you've got a base salary. It's great that you've got, you know, all of the resource and the pre-sales and anything else that you need from the company. The same way someone who buys a McDonald's franchise is going to get everything they need from McDonald's, but ultimately it's their business. This is your business to grow as a sales guy. You need to demand and make sure you understand what you need to succeed and take the accountability to grow it as your business, because you're the sales guy and ultimately the buck stops with you. It's why we get paid the big bucks and it's why we take the most pressure.
Definitely. At the end of the day, you're the CEO of your own business. And I've honestly heard that everywhere I've sold. And it comes down to holding yourself accountable at the end of the day and holding yourself responsible for it. But yeah, that's super helpful. Avi, thank you so much today for your time and this conversation. It's been great. I've enjoyed it. And looking forward to doing this more often. Hopefully we can keep in touch and do this in the future again.
Absolutely. Thanks, George. Thanks, guys, for listening. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers. Have a good day.